In this video for coinpoker.com, we are going to be discussing 3 tips to crush low stakes poker. I regularly get asked by players who are struggling to win, even at the smallest stakes games, how do they actually win? And I recognize that there's a lot of training material and coaching material available on the internet, on this YouTube channel, other YouTube channels, my training site, pokercoaching.com, and a whole lot of other places too. And I know that it takes a lot of time and effort to go through all of that content. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 of my best actionable tips that you can use the next time you play so that you can start crushing the low stakes games right now. Tip number 1 is to stop overplaying marginal hands before the flop. At this point, most players understand reasonable pre-flop raising ranges when everyone folds to them, and most players do that if they are actually trying to win at poker. If pre-flop raising ranges are unfamiliar to you, make sure you check out peakgto.com. There we have all sorts of pre-flop charts available for you for free. That said, when someone raises and then they get re-raised, they often struggle. The biggest mistakes happen when you are facing aggressive actions. And what a lot of people do wrong is that when they raise with a medium strength hand and they get re-raised, they call and see the flop to see if they hit, and then they go from there. The problem with that, though, is that when you call a 3-bet with a marginal hand like 7-5 suited or King 10 offsuit, and you actually flop something like a pair, it's not particularly good. You're very likely to be in very bad shape. So you have to learn to get rid of your marginal hands before the flop. Alternatively, other players do the opposite. They think their only option is to re-raise and load their money into the pot, often with only their best hands. So they re-raise with all their best hands and then just fold everything that's marginal or bad. And then that's also a big mistake. So let's go through a few pre-flop ranges. These are available on peakgto.com. So here we have an 80 big blind under the gun, raise first in range. The hands in red are raised, the hands in blue are folded. Notice, you do not limp, just call the big blind. You don't do that with anything. You're either raising or you're folding. What I want to take a look at is which hands are not playing 80 big blinds deep in a tournament. Notice, low suited connectors are not played. A lot of people think 4-3 suited is a great hand. Well, I hate to break it to you. No, it's not. Notice even 6-5 suited under the gun doesn't love it. Now, if you wanted to raise all of your 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, and all your small pairs, I don't think that's that big of a deal because most people do not re-raise often enough to begin with. But if you're trying to play good, strong, perfect GTO poker, the low suited connectors should just fold. Also notice what else is folding in the offsuit region of the chart. Ace-9 offsuit, Ace-8 offsuit, King-10 offsuit, Queen-10 offsuit, Jack-10 offsuit. These hands are not good enough to raise when you are in early position and should just be folded. Some people play those every time, and I think that is definitely a mistake. If you are going to widen your range a little bit, I would recommend widening it in the Ace-X suited region, King-X suited, and suited connected region, but definitely not in the offsuit region. Okay, what happens if you raise, and then the big blind re-raises you? So you raise under the gun, first to act, 8-handed, and then the big blind re-raises. So let's say you make it 2.5 big blinds, and they make it 10. Now take a look at what happens. The hands in green get to call. The hands in blue are now folding. Notice you wouldn't have raised all the hands in this blue chart to begin with. And then the hands in red are re-raising. Notice only aces and kings and a few bluffs with some ace-x suited and king-x suited are putting in the 4-bet. Why is that? Well, that's because the big blind should 3-bet you. They should re-raise with only a very, very, very tight range of about 5.6% of hands. Almost nothing, because they have to worry about you having this good, strong range. So when you raise and get re-raised, in this scenario, you're in position, you're getting, okay odds, and your range is really strong. And in this scenario, you just don't want to be re-raising because your opponent's range should also be strong. So you do some calling with hands that flop well enough. Notice we have like 6-5 suited here calling every time. That means every time that you raised it, you would call it. Notice you're not raising it a whole lot to begin with. Notice what also is not calling. King, Queen, Ace, Jack, King 10, Ace 10 offsuit. These offsuit hands are simply not that good. A lot of people think they are, but they are not. Notice some of the small and medium pairs are folding some portion of the time. I would recommend just calling those every time. But all the offsuit stuff really does want to be very, very cautious. And that's a mistake a lot of people make. They think if they raise with a hand like ace-jack offsuit or queen-9 offsuit and they get 3-bet, they have to call every time. But that is absolutely not true. Let's take a look at another scenario. Let's say 100 big blinds deep. You raise it up with these hands in red. And then the low jack, that would be first to act if there were 6 players at the table, 3-bets you. And then the button 4-bets you. So you raise from early position with this strong range. Somebody 3-bets and then somebody 4-bets. When it gets back to you, everything folds except for aces, kings, and ace-king. And even ace-king offsuit's folding about half the time. You may say, why are we folding so often? Well, you have to worry about the low jack having a decently strong hand, which they should because they 3-bet to begin with. And then the button has to have a really strong hand. And this is a scenario where, again, I see a lot of people putting in a call with pocket 8s or jack 9 suited or ace jack offsuit, just trying to flop well. And that is a blunder. When it goes raise, 3-bet, and 4-bet, you need a super duper good hand to get in. Now, if your opponents are overly loose, overly splashy, overly aggressive, then you could probably get it in with queens, ace-king every time, maybe ace-queen suited. But you can't get too carried away whenever you raise from early position, somebody 3-bets and somebody 4-bets. You must get out of the way, and cold calling, it's not really cold calling, I suppose, calling that 4-bet, say you make it 2.5 big blinds, the low jack makes it 7, the button makes it 17. Calling that 17 in this scenario is simply not a good play pretty much ever. And that's something a lot of recreational players do very, very wrong. So do not call that 4-bet and try to flop well. Tip number 2 is to bet for thin value and then fold more often than GTO would recommend when you get raised. Many players in the small stakes game simply do not value bet thinly enough on all betting rounds, and that's especially true on the river. You're going to find that finding these value bets, though, will add a huge amount to your profit. When you decide to bet for thin value and you get raised, you should be folding a lot. Well, why is that? That's because not enough players find bluff raises on the river, and if your opponent is bluffing too infrequently, your logical adjustment should be to overfold with hands that do not fare well against their value raising range. And most players who raise you on the river usually have a really strong range, like almost the nuts and better. And this is why betting thinly for value is so great, because if your opponent is rarely going to bluff raise you, but they'll call with all sorts of marginal stuff, you can extract value with your good but non-premium hands. Let's take a look at some examples here. Here we have queen 9 suited. We raise it up on the button to $6, playing 1-2 no limit hold'em. Big blind calls. Flop comes 9-7-4. They check. What would you do in this scenario? Well, we're going to continuation bet. $9 on this somewhat draw-heavy board. The opponent calls. Turns it to a clubs. The opponent checks. What should we do? Well, definitely bet again. We have the best hand almost always. If we get raised, it is not great. We don't love it. But this is a spot where, again, most people don't raise nearly often enough. We get called. River's a 6 of spades, and the opponent checks. Now, what I want you to do is think about if we can value bet when the board runs out like this, such as this straight now gets there. Notice 10-8 gets there. If the opponent had 7-6 or 9-6, they also get there. So is our hand good enough to value bet? Take a second, pause the video if you feel inclined, and let me know in the comments section down below what you think. Should we check? Bet small, like $20? Bet medium, like 45? Should we pot it, or should we put all of our money in? Give it some thought. This is what you have to do when you're actually playing poker. This is a situation where when the opponent checks, our hand is definitely good enough to value bet, especially in small stakes games where the opponents will not check raise bluff often enough. In this spot, we can easily get called by a worse 9, and then maybe some hero calls with a hand like a 7, or maybe even a 4, or perhaps a hand like 6-5 that happen to make a pair of 6s on the end. So we're going to go for value. In general, when you are in position on the river, the smallest bet size you should ever use, unless you are really trying to exploit your opponent in some way, is roughly half pot. If you bet smaller, you risk getting check raised, and in exchange, you're not really extracting that much value. Something a lot of people do wrong on the river in position is to bet tiny, like $12, thinking they're trying to eke out a little bit of value here. But then you do run the risk of getting check raised. From out of position is a different story because your opponent can always put in a raise. But in this scenario, we're allowed to just check it back and realize our equity, right? So in order to value bet, we want to make sure we are extracting a reasonable amount of value. So for that reason, half pot is the smallest bet we are ever going to use. In general, when you are value betting on the river in position, with your weakest value hands that want to bet, usually those are going to use the half pot size, and your best hands are usually going to use a bigger size, like pot or all in. This top pair is certainly one of the weakest hands we can justify value betting. If we had a 7, I don't think we'd value bet here. So since this is one of the weakest hands we're going to value bet, logically this would fit into the small half pot bet size range. So that is what we do in this scenario. We discuss this logic thoroughly at pokercoaching.com in the tournament and cash game masterclasses, so make sure you check those out if you have not already. We bet 47, and again, a lot of people think in this spot their opponents will fold everything worse than their 9, but a lot of these players never actually experiment with using these bets. They just check because they're afraid. But this is definitely a spot where we can extract value from weaker 9s and 7s, and if we get raised, we'll just fold. This time the opponent calls. By the way, sometimes when they call, you're going to lose too. And that's okay. More often than not in this scenario, when we do go for this size, we are going to have the best hand. And this time they had a pretty logical calling hand. If I was in the opponent's shoes, I certainly would have called too. And this is a spot where by going for value, we extracted an additional $47. What is that? 23 and a half big blinds. That's a lot. If you are not extracting this 23 and a half big blinds in this scenario, pretty much every single time, you're going to have a tough time winning. Let's take a look at another spot. We have the ace-9 offsuit in the cutoff. We raise it up. The button calls. Flop comes king, 9, 8. From out of position, you should know that you need to check a ton, especially cutoff against button. We discussed this thoroughly at pokercoaching.com, and you can see this in peak GTO if you go through all of the post-flop simulations. Out of position on boards that should connect well with the button's range, you have to check a lot. And middle pair is a hand that very, very, very often wants to check because if you bet and get raised, it's miserably bad. But if you check, you induce bluffs, so you can easily check and call. We check, the opponent bets $10, easy call. You may say, why not raise? If we raise in this scenario, what's going to happen is the opponent's going to continue with all their kings, which we're in bad shape against, and all their better hands, which we're also obviously in bad shape against, draws like Jack 10, and then fold almost everything else. So when we have the best hand and they continue, when we have the best hand and we raise and they fold, they were usually in bad shape. And when they continue, we're now going to be in terrible shape. So we have to pick, would we rather play a small pot out of position as the favorites, or at least in decent shape, or a big pot out of position as a big underdog? It's up to you. If you raise, when you do get action here, you're going to be in very, very bad shape. So easy check call. Turns a 4, we're going to check. Opponent checks again. River's a 5. Should we check or should we value bet? Well, I think this is, again, a very, very easy spot to value bet. Yes, we could have the worst hand, but more often than not, this is a spot where we can extract value from weaker 9s, some 8s, maybe some bluff catchers like ace-5 suited if the opponent had it, maybe pocket 7s decides to call. And if we do bet and get raised, we can very easily fold. In terms of our size on the river, from out of position, when you're value betting, and you have one of the weakest hands in your value range, you usually want to use a tiny bet or a medium bet. So somewhere between like $4 in this spot and perhaps $18. I think this ace-9 is a hand that could certainly go either way. If this was a weaker hand like 10-9 or 10-7, not 10-7, 9-7, I would go for the even smaller size. But I think this size is going to be perfectly fine on the river in general. Now we get raised to $35. This is a spot a lot of people fear. They think, well, now I have to fold or I have to find a hero call. And yeah, you do. But we already know that in most small stakes games, most players drastically under bluff. So if your opponent's drastically under bluffing, how does your ace-9 fare? Well, the answer is not very good. So just fold. It's okay. This time, the opponent was nice enough to show the nuts. Who'd have thought? Tip number 3. To crush the small stakes games is to make sure you keep a proper bankroll, because if you do not have money, you cannot play. Even if you're the best player in the world and you're playing against terrible players, you will experience a lot of variance. Sometimes you're just going to lose. That is part of the game. It's important for you to plan ahead and keep a proper bankroll because that will allow you to always stay in the action. Imagine, you know that you make, let's say, $15 per hour playing small stakes games when you're playing. Well, if you're out of money because you played with a short bankroll and you just went on an inevitable bad run, you don't get to extract that $15. But if you keep a big bankroll, you can sit there and play all day, every day and extract $15 per hour as much as you possibly want. For this reason, I highly recommend you keep a proper bankroll. Also, keep track of your results to make sure you're actually beating the games that you are playing in. A lot of people just presume they're winning because their opponents are bad, but they don't realize that for various reasons, they're not actually winning. Maybe the rake is too high. Maybe you're also bad yourself. You want to make a point to keep track of your results. So, how big of a bankroll do you need? Well, I have a large article at pokercoaching.com/bankroll discussing proper bankroll management, but we'll give you the basics right here. Assuming you're playing a cash game, and let's say we're playing 1-2 no limit hold'em, you can multiply the numbers accordingly based on the size of the game you're actually playing. You want to figure out what your win rate is. If you're winning 3 big blinds per 100 hands, you need roughly 10,000 big blinds, or $20,000 if you are playing 1-2 no limit hold'em. This may sound like a ton of money, and to be fair, it is a lot of money. But 3 big blinds per hour, or 3 big blinds per 100 hands, is something like $2 per hour in live poker. If you're winning almost nothing, you got to keep a huge bankroll because you will have swings that feel quite substantial. If your win rate is higher, let's say 7 big blinds per 100 hands, which is a good win rate if you are playing online, then you need about 6,000 big blinds, or about $12,000 at 1-2 no limit hold'em. If you're playing a really soft live poker game, you can probably win something like 25 big blinds per 100 hands. Did I say per hour up here? 7 big blinds per 100 hands, 25 big blinds per 100 hands. If you are winning at 25 big blinds per 100 hands, you only need 2,000 big blinds, which is about $4,000, which is not very much at all. As your win rate increases, you need to keep a smaller bankroll because while you will still swing, your swings are going to be in the upward direction. Whereas if you're up here, winning at almost nothing, you're going to be roughly break even, maybe trending up a little bit. And that's going to result in sometimes you going on a really, really nasty downswing that will require you have a larger bankroll. If you're playing tournaments, let's assume you have a 30% return on investment, which is a pretty good return on investment if you're playing online. If you are playing in games with 45 players, you need to keep about 70 buy-ins. If you're playing games with 250 players, you need about 150 buy-ins. If you're playing large field events with 2,600 players, you need 375 buy-ins. So as the number of players in your tournament increases, you need to keep a bigger bankroll because you're going to win the tournament less often, right? If there's 2,600 players in your tournament, well, if you're break-even-ish, you're going to win it roughly 1 in 2,600 times. That's not very often at all. If you play one tournament per day, it's going to take you, 8 or 9 years to get a win on average. Sometimes you get more, sometimes you get less, but you get what I'm saying. You're going to have huge swings. Whereas if you're playing 45-player tournaments, you're going to take first, second, or third place far more often. Now, you don't win as much money compared to the larger field events, but you're going to have less variance. You're going to have less swings. I have the bankroll here for 9-player games, by the way. Nobody's going to have a 30% return on investment in 9-player games, so don't think that you're going to have some huge return on investment in sit and goes. It's just not going to happen. Now, if your return on investment is smaller, you need to keep a bigger bankroll. If your return on investment is bigger for some reason, because perhaps you found some really, really soft tournaments, maybe on coin poker, then perhaps you can keep a shorter bankroll. But notice, if you're playing an online tournament that has 200 players or so, you probably want to keep about 100 buy-ins, maybe a little bit more. Now, if you do poorly, you can always move down and give yourself a larger bankroll proportionally. And for that reason, you don't necessarily need, let's say, this full 100 buy-ins or 150 buy-ins to play the 245-player games. Maybe you only need 70. And if you do poorly, you can move down. But in general, I recommend keeping a larger bankroll than you perhaps even think you need, because maybe your assessment of your skill is a little bit off. Maybe you're not as good as you think you are. And also, maybe you're going to hit one of those really bad runs that's going to happen 5 or 10% of the time, and having that extra money in your bankroll will ensure you stay in action, which will allow you to continue extracting whatever edge you have. So that's it. That's 3 tips to crush low stakes poker. To recap, number 1, stop overplaying marginal hands pre-flop. They just aren't that good when your opponent wants to re-raise or re-raise and get all their money in. Tip number 2, bet thinly for value, especially on the river, but then fold way more often than GTO recommends when you get raised, because most people simply do not bluff raise the river anywhere near often enough. And tip number 3, keep a proper bankroll. If you don't play because you have no money, you're not going to make any money. So make sure you are properly bankrolled. That's it for today. Good luck in your games. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, feedback, let me know in the comment section down below. While you're down there, click the like and subscribe button, and I'll talk to you next time.